It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome into the Take Command podcast. Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulsen there, and with us for the entirety of the show today, Pro Football Focus's Trevor Sikkema. Trevor, what's up, dude?
Good to be with you, fellas. You saying the name of the podcast out loud made me think, what was the podcast named before they were the Commanders, right? I mean, like when they were like deciding what the team name was going to be, were you guys just in like the ultimate limbo of whatever the podcast is going to be? I'm just curious.
No.
Take Command's a great name, but obviously, you know, it couldn't have been around that.
So this is actually a funny story. So Logan and I started a couple months after they changed to Commanders. Okay. So like the pod was not in a Washington football, which like our buddy JP Finley, for instance, they changed from like the Washington football talk podcast to now they're like the Beltway football talk. Like they've changed iterations of names 3 or 4 times. For us though, which I feel like I can definitely tell this story now. Part of the reason the podcast was named Take Command is because when they changed to Commanders, that was kind of the team hashtag. And we're like, well, we can take advantage of that. They don't have a trademark on the hashtag. And they just changed it to Raise Hail. They're kind of entering the next phase here. And so our plan, I don't know whether it's expired. I don't know whether people will still use it. I don't know whether it ever actually worked, but that's how the podcast was named. Not my call, not Logan's call. Someone above us made that decision.
I think Raise Hail is actually like a fun thing to say out loud, but the reason why I just laughed is because every single time I hear the phrase Raise Hail, being in North Carolina where I am, I can only say the words praise Dale afterwards for Dale Earnhardt. So it's like, it's just an immediate one after the other. So that's why I laugh. So like Raise Hail, like I said, is actually like kind of like intimidating and, you know, like it's kind of a good hashtag, but I can only think of Raise Hail, praise Dale.
And of course, Junior, a huge Washington football fan.
It's true.
There you go. Full circle.
Wow.
Full circle. What do you know? What do you know? Believe it or not, that's not what we're going to talk about on the rest of the podcast.
Could be.
Coming up, Drew. Good call, Trevor. 30 minutes or so from now, we're going to hit a couple things first. But one of the things I've really been thinking a lot about, and I know Logan has as well, is kind of this disconnect between the draft community, if you will, who was and still is very high on Drake Maye versus the NFL. It seems by the end of the process was very, very high on Jayden Daniels and kind of why that is. And so we're going to explore that with Trevor coming up a little bit later in the show. But we want to start league-wide and the surprises of the draft. So Trevor, if I say, what's the biggest surprise of the NFL draft to you? I think probably Michael Penix comes to mind. But is there anybody else that even comes close?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the Penix selection. There's just, for so many reasons, it was a massive surprise. You know, I think of the rest of were there any like major quarterback drafts that were like overdrafted? No, not really. Like even the Bo Nix selection, you know, like I understand why they took him at 12. 5 quarterbacks had already gone off the board. What are they going to do? Get a little bit cute, pick up 1 or 2 4th round picks just to maybe not get the quarterback that they really, really need on that roster. So I think it just has to be Penix because I'm trying to think in my head. The corners going a little bit later was sort of surprising to me. Pass rushers a little bit later, but we thought that was possible. Maybe Brock Bowers falling out of the top 10. But again, for how many quarterbacks went in the top 12, you know, that's half the top 12 right there. So you're losing a lot of spots. You do those wide receivers, we're going to be another 3. So we're just running out of places for Brock Bowers to eventually go. So the number one surprise to me just has to be Michael Penix and what the Falcons were doing. And it's not even necessarily wow, they took this guy really early. It was the team building aspect of it. Like that's the big surprise here. We're one-upping the Aaron Rodgers situation, the Jordan Love situation. Like we're taking that to an insane degree because those guys late first round picked in the 20s. Like you're taking this guy number 8 overall, and then the general manager comes up after the draft and Terry Fontenot says, yeah, I mean, the best case scenario, Penix doesn't have to play for 4 to 5 years. Buddy, 4 to 5 years? You just wasted the whole rookie contract with this guy. And that's part of what makes drafting a quarterback so valuable. Yeah, you want to nail it. And if you nail it and he's great, 4 or 5 years from now, let's say he takes over and he plays another 10 years. Sure, that's a reality that exists where this was a success. But unfortunately, there's just much more likely paths of this pick not really working out the way that you want it to. And it just the aggressiveness of how they wanted to go after the quarterback position this offseason is fascinating. And then the level of luxury pick this was. I don't know if this has ever been duplicated in NFL history, especially for this position. Because you look at Terry Fontenot and his draft history, okay, he drafted a tight end at 4. He drafted a running back at 8. He drafted a wide receiver at 8, I think, when he didn't really need to. And now you're drafting a quarterback that is absolutely not going to play for you unless things get really bad financially with the investment that you made in Kirk Cousins. It's just, man, that has to be the surprise of the draft. And there weren't too many that were even close to that just because of, the points that I made.
So I think probably one of the reasons that they did that is that they had a really high grade on him. Is there a world where you see him as being the best graded quarterback, or do you just think that's like a crazy reach? I know there's a lot of people that say, oh, I had him here or whatever, but it ultimately comes down to like where the Falcons had him. And like, do you understand the perspective that he could have been the best quarterback on their board at 8?
At 8, certainly. Yes, totally believe that. I can absolutely believe a world where Caleb Williams, Drake Maye, Jayden Daniels, they're already off the board. They, no question about it, could have had Michael Penix above J.J. McCarthy and Bo Nix. I would even believe them having Michael Penix second best quarterback in this class. Now, if you had him over Caleb, that's something where I go, okay, now I just got to question a lot of the other, how you kind of like see the game and how you see these players. Because I think it's hard to watch Caleb Williams unless you just absolutely don't believe that he could become more of a controlled player at the NFL level. Then Caleb basically does everything better than Penix, is much younger and doesn't have the injury history. So that would be a very, very tough sell to me. But yeah, to answer your question, of course, I can absolutely believe that they would have him ranked there, because here's the thing too, when it comes to this pick, it's not that it's logicless. It's not that, right, oh, this is the worst pick of all time, there's no way this works out, or there's no defending it. No. That's not true either. There is logic to it. You can hear it. You can get to that point of how they wanted to draft these players. But again, I think that there are more likely realities where this does not work out the way that you want it to. The return on investment is not as good as what you think it is going to be. So yeah, when I watched Michael Penix over the last 2 years, he's a gunslinger, man. We saw it this past year. He was a Heisman Trophy finalist. He got to a national championship. So what he does as a pocket passer with a massive arm and just kind of that fearless passing mentality, there's no question that a lot of organizations would gravitate toward that in the draft. But he doesn't exactly have the best ball placement out there. He's a little bit older. He's got that injury history to him. Is he ever going to be that pinpoint accurate quarterback that you need him to be at the NFL level? Like, the crazy thing to me is that the Falcons talk about Michael Penix as if in 2 years, when he starts for the first time, it's like he can be good to go. Like we're going to have like an all-pro quarterback like right away. But it's like, I don't know if that's going to be the case. Like, I still think that he's got some learning and growing to do and some consistencies to really clean up before he gets to that level at the NFL. So, yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question.
Yeah, I think, Logan, too, we obviously spent a lot of time on this last week, and then we listened to the Move the Six pod, and Daniel Jeremiah brought up a great point about this that we hadn't even talked about, which is the locker room dynamics. When you talk about Rodgers, for instance, in Green Bay, or Favre in Green Bay, when Rodgers was drafted, like, those guys had equity. Like, Kirk Cousins is going to walk into that building for the first time, and it's like, hey, we've already drafted your replacement. And so there's just so many ways in which this feels incredibly hopeful and optimistic to work out and thread the needle in the way the Falcons want to, versus I think a lot more logical picks that could have been made at that point in the draft, or decisions if they wanted to trade out if there were opportunities to do so. And I think there's been some leak calls of like the Jets and others calling Fontenot and inquiring about 8. So definitely seemed like it could have been on the board. Logan, did you have a big surprise, whether first round or later in the draft, that you wanted to hit on as we talk about our surprises of the draft?
No, just to kind of piggyback on the Atlanta Falcons thing, like, I think they were just kind of marching to the beat of their own drum. They draft Rukaroro with their second pick in the draft, and like, I don't know where Trevor had him, but I didn't have him that high. I think he's a good player, but I thought he's kind of a later second round, early third round player. But the thing, I wanted to ask Trevor, honestly, is like, did you have a obviously surprises, but did you have any selections where you're like, man, that is a perfect, that it couldn't have got any better for this team, like kind of perfect fits? Maybe it's for receivers, maybe it's for defensive linemen. And again, because you're the draft expert, so let's get the insight on that.
Yeah. So look, I was trying to tell Chargers fans for a couple of weeks leading up to the draft, your team's best draft strategy is to take an offensive lineman in the first round, whether it was at 5 or whether it was trading back and still getting one of the best top guys. Like, Chargers fans did not want to hear it. And I get it. Like, the receivers were so bad last year. You've got Justin Herbert. You want people to throw to. You dream of Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze or whatever. But the best path for this team was always to draft the offensive tackle in the first round. And to get Joe Alt, I think, was okay, maybe not like scheme fit exactly to the words of your question, but philosophically, this is exactly how you want to build your team. You now have Rashawn Slater.
Sorry to cut you off. Were you surprised that it was Joe Alt? I was a little surprised. I thought, because like there's all that smoke around, they want a more physical right tackle, J.C. Latham, what's the guy's name? Fuaga from Oregon State. Like, were you surprised it was Joe Alt, or was that kind of something that you thought was just kind of, was he your best tackle, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, he was my top offensive tackle. So in that sense, it wasn't a surprise. I think in the moment, I was shocked that it was Joe Alt at number 5, just because there was so much smoke about Latham for the reasons that you mentioned, with them wanting to get more physical, them wanting to run the ball more, have more of a mauler on their offensive line. And not that Joe Alt can't be fantastic as a run blocker. I want to make that clear. And I think that's what goes into the surprise is leading up to the draft, we told ourselves like, oh, he's going to want a more physical run blocker, a Fuaga, a J.C. Latham, somebody like that. The Chargers would love to trade back as well. So are they going to get fancy and try to trade back, still get one of those offensive tackles as well? And they could have done that. But then at the end of the day, I think that I don't know if it's cooler heads prevailed or what happened. Or, maybe it was as simple as a month ago, Harbaugh and Ortiz, the general manager, and Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator, just like everybody got in a room and Harbaugh went, why don't we just take the best offensive tackle? Right. And everybody went, yeah, okay, all right, yeah, sure, I guess. I mean, when you put it like that, yeah. And so, like, I was shocked that it was Joe Alt because of all the smoke and all the hype that we had heard for Latham or a trade back and things like that. But after, like, 60 seconds after it happened, I'm sitting there on the draft show and I go, of course they did. Right? Like, of course they took the consensus OT1 in the draft at number 5 when they needed one. Yeah, of course. So that's kind of how that's been one of those picks that I like the strategy. I like the fit there. That one's a lot of fun to me. I think so. I actually want to shout this one out. So I wasn't the biggest fan of Chop Robinson. I didn't have him with a first round grade. I think he's more of like kind of like a pass rush specialist. But for Miami specifically, I actually do like this pick. Now at 21, okay, we can talk about value. It's a little bit of a different.
Because you've kind of been like a Chop Robinson hater. I hate to put you on blast like that.
Okay, all right, okay, all right.
But you've been leading that. You've been leading that charge. Only 3 sacks. They're against whoever it was.
The good news is Logan listens to the podcast. The bad news is Logan listens to the podcast.
No, look, I can stand by all my draft takes. It is totally fair game. That is fine. And I was a little bit of a Chop Robinson hater. And I'll tell you what.
I'm in the same boat, just to be clear, just to like take a little heat off you there.
This was a little bit of me looking at last year's class. And everybody in last year's class was talking about Tyree Wilson, right? Oh, Tyree Wilson, top 15 pick, top 10 pick. He's the next type of like Trayvon Walker guy. And I remember watching Wilson last year, and it felt like it was consensus that Wilson was like a top 12 player in this class. And I remember watching Wilson, I'm like, what am I missing? What am I missing with this guy? Yeah, he's big and he's tall, but he doesn't really get off the ball. The pad level's not there. He doesn't have the backfield production. He doesn't really have bend to him. He's just got long arms and he's got a nice speed to power move. Okay, a lot of people have that at the NFL level. Measurables are only so much of a force multiplier when you're not really that much of a diverse pass rusher after that. So I remember giving Tyree Wilson a second round grade, but I didn't really stand on that conviction as much as I wanted to last year. And I felt like I absolutely should have. And that's kind of one of those things you learn the longer you do this as a scout. You get more confidence to be able to kind of get away from the group thing because, kind of what you guys were talking about, what we were talking about a little bit before the show. Like if the NFL sees something way different than how I see it, I mean, I go, well, shoot, I mean, am I just not seeing it correctly? So I was lower on Tyree Wilson, but honestly, like I could have been even a little bit lower on. Now, that's not to say that he's not going to work out, but it was a much less of a guarantee that he was going to work out than I think people were giving it credit for. So now you fast forward to this year, Chop Robinson. As I'm watching him, I'm kind of thinking the same thing. Is a lot of people have this guy as a top 4 edge rusher, a top 20 overall pick on their, or a top 20 ranked player on their big board. You know, you have to bet on players with this athleticism. And I look at him and I go, okay, well, he didn't really have the measurables or the strength level to be able to be a solid run defender. So I'm not sure how I like him when it comes to early down situations. He's got shorter arms and he's got shorter legs. So even though he's explosive, he doesn't really cover a ton of ground when he's getting out of his stance. So offensive tackles can sometimes still cut him off, even though he's a great athlete. When it comes to arm length, he's going to lose that battle against NFL offensive tackles often. And in order to really mitigate that, you have to be fantastic at block shedding and have a lot of different counters and moves. And really, you have to be able to anticipate what offensive tackles are going to do with their hands. And he doesn't. He really doesn't. He just wins as an athlete right now at the college level. And so we saw a pretty high pass rush win percentage because eventually he'd get by these offensive tackles. But the lack of backfield production shows you, okay, well, even though he's getting off the line really quickly and eventually he's getting by these offensive tackles, he's not doing it quick enough and he's not anticipating well enough to actually be able to make tackles in the backfield and end those plays. It only gets harder to do that at the NFL level. If you didn't do that in college, how am I supposed to think you're going to take this massive leap in the NFL, especially when you're not really changing positions? People bring up Micah Parsons all the time, but Micah Parsons was an off-ball linebacker. And then he switched over to edge, so it was a little bit of a different story for him. So when I watch Chop Robinson, I just go, okay, I can see where you are going to be successful. But it's not, I cannot subscribe to, just incredible athlete, just draft him. You got to be able to see how he uses that athleticism. You know, is there more in the tank? Are you going to evolve past that? Are you going to use that to increase different parts of your game? Are you going to be able to get better as a run defender? All these kinds of things. So I look at him and I had him 40th overall on my big board. I think he would have been an excellent second round pass rush specialist type of a player. And honestly, going back to the Miami point, you draft him at 21 and it's a situation where is that higher of where he was selected than where he was on my big board? Yes. But in Miami specifically, they got Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb both coming back from season-ending injuries. They got Shaq Barrett, who's a good veteran edge rusher as well, but he's somebody who hasn't really been the same since the Achilles. And a point that my boss, Chris Collinsworth, made when we were on the draft show is it's hot in Miami. I don't know if you guys knew that, but you're playing 8 home games a year, and those dudes get tired. Like conditioning in Miami is different than conditioning in other places around the country when you're playing those games. And so you've got to, for Miami, Miami is a team that emphasizes speed at every single position. And to truly get the most out of players' speed, what do you have to do? You have to keep them fresh. So you got to keep that defensive line deep and you got to keep it talented. You got to keep it athletic. So I actually really like the Chop Robinson fit where he landed in Miami, even though it was a little bit of a reach versus where I had him picked.
So for the Commanders, what was your favorite pick that they made? And we'll take Daniels off the board. So we're going to obviously talk about him in a few minutes here. But you look at the Commanders draft. What'd you like?
A lot, man. I gave this draft an A. I mean, it's tough to look at any of their selections really and say, yeah, I didn't really like this one. Maybe some of the prioritization of it, but if I'm about to answer, and I am, the fact that Jer'Zhan Newton was my favorite pick outside of Jayden Daniels, then I can't sit there and say, oh my goodness, I love that they went best player available approach at that spot and got one of my top 12 players in the class at number 36. And then I can't 2 rounds later go, I wouldn't have drafted Ben Sennett. I would have gone offensive tackle there. The way that Washington went about this, to me, is exactly what they were supposed to do. Okay. New ownership, new coach, new quarterback, new everything, new direction, all that kinds of stuff. This is a multi-year thing, right? And that's not to say that they're not going to be gunning to win as many games as possible this upcoming year. They are. And Dan Quinn, I think, is somebody who I think has deserved another head coaching shot for a while in the NFL. I'm excited for him. I think that Washington's going to be competitive and play spoiler a little bit this upcoming year. But they know that the Super Bowl window for them is a couple of years away. They got to build it out. That's why they made all the moves in free agency to get some of those guys off of the roster, get new guys in. You're really changing the identity and the core of some of those second stringers and guys that are just going to be the depth players for you. And in the draft, you're drafting these players not necessarily to fill the immediate short-term need. You're drafting the guys that you want to be really peaking and contributing for your team 2 years, 3 years from now when that winning window you're hoping is wide open. So to me, it's why I love the Jer'Zhan Newton pick, despite people going, well, hold on, they've got Payne and Allen. Where's he going to play? Well, one, he's going to get a great rotation anyways. And I think that Newton played too many snaps a season when he was in college. Like Illinois just never let this guy off the field. And some people watch Jer'Zhan Newton and they go, okay, well, his play and his production is more flashy than it is consistent. I'd push back on that a little bit, but I would also say, well, go look at his snap count. He's playing more than 700 snaps a season. Byron Murphy, for example, who they're comparing him to, Byron Murphy's playing like 400 or 500. If you get in a situation where now Newton is actually rotating in with some good interior defensive linemen, well, all of a sudden you got an incredible trio of interior defensive linemen I think could really work out for you. So I love that pick, not just because of how talented I think that Newton is, not how much I think he could work out in the short and long term, but also just the draft strategy overall for them that really set the tone throughout the rest of the draft to get a lot of good players that I think could really contribute for him down the road.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight. Obviously, Mike Sanders still kind of falls in that same bucket, I would assume, for you. But the interesting one to me is Brandon Coleman. What position? How did you have him projected? And do you think he can play left tackle in the NFL?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think he can play tackle at the NFL level. Now, I've talked with some Washington people since the draft, and it's like, I don't know if he could do that year one, right? And because everybody's like, oh, they need a tackle so badly, we got to throw him out there year one. And every time that I seem to talk to Washington peeps about it, and I say, hey, it might take a little bit of time for Coleman, they get a little disappointed. They're like, well, we need somebody right now. Well, again, not really. Sure, you would like to be better at offensive tackle right now, but that's not always how it works. You really want him to be ready in 2 to 3 years, and I think that he absolutely can. So Coleman, a little bit of a background for him, grew up overseas, grew up in Germany. His father was part of the military, so that's where they lived. I think it was until he was 15. Comes over to the States, wants to play basketball first, so tries out basketball, plays basketball in high school. Doesn't play football for the first time until his junior year of high school. So he plays 2 years of high school ball. Ends up going to a JUCO because obviously he's a zero-star recruit. He's barely played football. Goes from JUCO to TCU, and at TCU he kind of like bounced around between like guard and tackle. I think he could play tackle. I really do. I think he's a really nice athlete. I think he's built really well. He's got good size, he's got good movement skills. He just doesn't quite know what he's doing yet. Like you can see the anticipatory parts of the game where he will, like these are the times that he's been playing tackle, right? I'll watch him and he'll get out of his stance. The kick slide will be beautiful. He'll absolutely beat the edge rusher to the spot. But then if an edge rusher immediately kind of like puts his foot in the ground and then hits him with an inside move, like an arm over, a swim or something, you'll just see Coleman. He was so focused on protecting the outside shoulder that he'll give up the inside shoulder a little bit. And he'll be a little late to, get into that guy's chest and really kind of ride his momentum, keeping him in front of the quarterback, like all that kinds of stuff. So it's that thing where you could almost like see the wheels still turning in his head where he goes like, shoot, I forgot. Like I got it. On my like third step, I have to kind of like plant and be ready to protect myself inside. So to me, Coleman he was one of my favorite developmental offensive tackles in this class. I had him top 80 for sure, but he might have been like top 75. He's right around that like 70 rank area. So where they got him, I think was good and appropriate for how good he could be. I do think he could be a starter at tackle at the NFL level. It just might not be this year, or if it is this year, he might struggle a little bit. And I think year 2, year 3 is where he really starts to blossom.
How much difference did you have in him versus Patrick Paul, Roger Rosengarten, like that kind of crop of players that most people were projecting Washington to be looking at either 36 or 40? Obviously, they traded out of 40. But that was kind of the thought. And even, Logan and I did our preview show. I don't know. We did so many freaking podcasts and so many shows that Thursday, Friday. But I think it was late Thursday night, Logan, when we talked about it. And we're like, what do they do? And we were like, I would expect them to just take a tackle at 36 and then proceed with the draft from there. And then in hindsight, you look at it and I'm like, I don't know. Coleman sounds really intriguing. Maybe this was the better plan all along. How much of a gap did you have in that two groups of prospects?
So I had Coleman ranked 70th on my big board. I had Rosengarten 99th, and I had Patrick Paul 101. So I had Coleman about a full round ahead of those other two guys. And I like those other two guys somewhat. I like Rosengarten obviously more. I think he's a really nice athlete. I think he is a finesse offensive lineman who plays with a chip on his shoulder, which normally those things like don't go together, right? Normally you talk about like these big maulers and you go like, oh, he plays nasty, plays with a chip on his shoulder. And then the finesse guys, you're like, oh, they're just more about like technique and staying in front of you, but they don't have overwhelming power. Well, Rosengarten has that mentality of a mauler, but he's got more of the finesse game. So he's very intriguing to me, but I think he's got to get a lot stronger to really succeed at the NFL level. He's got to put on some weight. If he could get some weight in his lower half, that'd be nice, because right now I think that he just gets blown back a little bit too easily, needs to be able to anchor a little bit better. That power game only gets a lot stronger in the NFL. And with Rosengarten coming from the Pac-12, I mean, all due respect, RIP, the Pac-12, but you're not going up against like some of the strongest power rushers in the country there. It's not like you're going in the SEC every single week with a lot of these just bigger, heavier defensive linemen. So it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment for him. Patrick Paul, he was projected as potentially like a top 50, top 60 pick at the beginning of the season. And he's another guy that I watched in summer scouting. And I was like, I don't see it. Yeah. His 2022 season, he was literally just big. Like, that's it. He was just big. His back was rounded. His pad level was not good. His hand timing was all over the place. He wasn't really able to generate a ton of power through his legs because he just didn't have the right posture. Like, his feet were slow in 2022. And I'm like, okay, like I get the size allurement, but top 60, I mean, this guy's going to get eaten alive if he gets drafted in the top 60 and you're playing him right away. So,
where did he end up getting drafted? He got drafted at 58, right?
55, I think, to the Dolphins. Yeah. And I don't know if he's going to have to start right away with the Dolphins. I know they'd like to upgrade a tackle, but as long as Armstead's still there, I think they're okay. But all that to say, like, Paul's 2023 season was better. He was more coordinated with his footwork. The posture was better. He had more of like a flat back, so you could see him like actually generate power from the lower half a lot more. So all of that, I think, did get better for him. But still, I just worried about the overall athleticism, and I worried about, okay, are you just blocking people in the Big 12 because you're just larger than them? And it kind of felt like that was his advantage a little bit more. So that's kind of how I saw those two offensive tackles, guys who I think should have been picked around the top 100. But honestly, like I like Coleman's potential more. I really do.
And what about like Kingsley Suamataia and Kieran Amadiji from Yale? Like, where did you have those guys? Because those were two other names that were kind of floating around. They came in for visits with the Commanders, and obviously we're really happy with Coleman, but just curious to kind of like paint that landscape, because those are the four guys that I kind of bucketed in with Coleman here, I guess.
Yeah, so I Coleman ranked 70. I had Kingsley Suamataia at 66. And then I actually had Kieran Amadiji. I felt like I was pretty high on him. I had him at 57. So I had him the highest of kind of like the guys in this group. I really liked Kieran's tape, man. It's sort of hard to evaluate because it's Ivy League level football, right? And he just very clearly, you're like 5 plays into his tape and you go, okay, you're a future NFL player, right, playing against guys that probably won't make it into the league. But I felt as though Kieran, the reason why I was a lot higher on him on my big board is because I thought, okay, even if he doesn't make it at tackle, you have absolutely a starting level NFL guard. And I think that he gives you that kind of versatility to succeed and earn a starting spot, either at tackle or guard. I think he moves really well. I think he's got great power to him. Now, again, it's Ivy League level competition, so we'll see what happens once the pads start kind of cracking and he gets a chance at the NFL level. But he doesn't really have to start right away with Chicago, so I think that's also to his advantage. He can kind of get a little bit stronger, get acclimated to how NFL life is going to be, which I think is important for his development. Suamataia, a former 5-star guy, started his career at Oregon, ended up transferring back to BYU to be a little bit closer to home. He's played left tackle, he's played right tackle, so he's got that flip side of the line of scrimmage kind of versatility to him. The thing with Suamataia is really good mover, explosive mover. But right now, I explain this the same way that I explained Tyler Guyton. I think these two guys are very, very similar in this regard. They're sort of like, they're not really blockers, they're shovers. Yeah. So like if a defensive lineman will come into them and they're trying to generate as much power as they can to just shove them as far as they can away from where the quarterback is. They're not really, or it's not as consistent. They're not like hands inside, getting our hands locked up to you, really being able to control that block, not being able to let go, not let guys, block shed and get the hands off of you, that kinds of stuff. So those are the things where it can work at the college level because pass rushers aren't really privy to that. They don't really know what to do, especially when you're just more athletic and you're stronger than they are, like Suamataia was, especially at BYU against that level of competition. But in the NFL, if you're not more patient and your mission is not more like, let me get my hands on you and not let go, well, all of a sudden, if you're swinging your hands to try to push as hard as you can, there's going to be plenty of times where you're going up against pass rushers who are ready for it, and they're just immediately going to swipe your hands away, get the arm over, and boom, all of a sudden, it's a quick sack. So that's the dangerous part of Suamataia's game right now. Really good athlete, somebody who I can understand why the Chiefs took him to develop him as a starting offensive tackle. But again, in his current state, what he is right now is not going to succeed consistently at the NFL level. He's got to kind of change how he approaches it. But he does have the athletic ability and the build to be able to be a starting tackle in the league.
Wrapping up here on Take Command, our guest today, of course, Pro Football Focus's Trevor Sikkema. So the Drake Maye, Jayden Daniels discussion is one that is never going to die, much to, I think, all of our chagrin. But it's the kind of thing that we'll be monitoring for the rest of their careers, obviously. But I think from a draft perspective, it's really interesting to watch Drake Maye be the, not universal, but the favorite amongst, whether it's you, Nate Tice, like Mina. There's so many smart NFL people that look at this and are like, it's obviously Drake Maye, QB2. And then the more and more reporting that comes out about how the league feels, like our buddy John Kine from ESPN obviously did a lot of reporting on this as the Commanders ultimately draft Daniels. And John's like, everybody I talked to, they said Daniels was QB2. You got people like Louis Riddick, who used to work in the league, saying that actually for Louis, he was QB1. Where do you think the disconnect is in kind of the way you see it and the way so many in the league seem to see it? And why do you think, and Logan, you ended on Daniels as QB2 as well, or right there with McCarthy. We both had them as kind of 2A, 2B almost, if you will. So like, where do we think that this disconnect is? What are the factors that maybe the NFL weighs heavier than you do? And Trevor, I'd be curious as kind of we get through this conversation here, if that affects how you look at quarterback at all moving forward.
Yeah. So look, I think the way that I would describe the difference between kind of how maybe draft Twitter, social media saw Maye versus Daniels, and the reason why the NFL liked Daniels a lot better is because I think Daniels is more repeatable right now, right? He's much more consistent. I think Daniels had the best fundamentals of any quarterback in this class. I think that people look at him and they go, "Oh, running quarterback, yeah, but he needs to be more consistent," right? It's like the stereotype, like, "Oh, if they're a rushing quarterback, they're not really consistent as a pocket passer or anything like that." I think that Daniels is incredibly fast, and obviously we've seen that a lot. But I also think he's got very good fundamentals. I mean, from his footwork all the way through his throwing motion, it is very repeatable. You know what you are getting every time. And I think the NFL absolutely loves that. So they go, okay, you already have the muscle memory down. Now I just need to teach you where to look and when. And I think that to NFL coaches seems to be an easier talking point or selling point of, oh, I can work with this player. Whereas Drake Maye, if you ask me, better arm talent, more diverse thrower. I mean, he is somebody who can layer throws at every single level, whether you're talking about vertical thirds or whether you're talking about horizontal thirds. I mean, any combination of them. I think Drake Maye has showcased the ability and the success level to hit all sorts of throws against all sorts of coverages at any point in the field. And I think he could do so with really good velocity, better velocity than Jayden Daniels. But the footwork, the fundamentals sometimes escape Maye. And I think that makes teams nervous. Like if we have to change how a guy is throwing versus what we've seen in college, well, like how much is that going to stick? Is it going to be consistent? And I think that kind of makes teams a little bit nervous because I think the big detractor from Drake Maye, especially this past season, was he just misses. Like he just misses some throws. He kind of, he kind of made some decisions that he'd like to have back, but man, I mean, he's like he's still a young gunslinger quarterback. I feel like that part of it was getting a little bit overblown. But the accuracy, just the missed throws, and you just go, man, like, why did you miss that? There was no real need to miss that throw. I think really frustrates teams. And where you look at Daniels, there just aren't there. There's not a lot of that. I mean, sure, he could speed up his process as well, but when Daniels sees it well, I mean, it's a beautiful step drop. He is fully balanced. The feet are light. He can move directions very easily. He can put his foot in the ground. And like I said, he can generate a ton of power from that back foot. The feet are married up with the shoulders and exactly where the ball is going. The follow through is beautiful. Like, it is all there for Daniels. That part of his game is so repeatable. It is so clean. You don't have to worry about it. So that paired with the rushing ability that he has, although of course, we could talk about the fact that he needs to protect himself a lot better when actually taking off the football. That to me is where I think the NFL is just, they prioritize that part of it more than maybe we do on the outside, because we're not the ones that are necessarily coaching them. We're sitting here saying like, okay, but look at what Drake did in 2022. You've got to believe that you can get something in the middle as a starting point and then make him even better in the NFL. And when you do that, in my opinion, Drake Maye's arm is significantly feels too strong of a word, but like, it's better than Daniels. I think Maye has higher arm talent than Daniels does. I think Daniels has an adequate arm for the NFL level, and he can hit NFL throws, but it's not quite what Caleb's was. It's not quite what Drake's is. It's not quite what even like McCarthy's is and Penix, right? I mean, I think Daniels is closer to Bo Nix than any of those guys that I mentioned before, but you don't really think about that a ton because his fundamentals are so clean that he maximizes his arm basically on every single throw. So it doesn't look like he's really like forcing it or anything like that. It still looks smooth. So those are kind of the things that come to my head when I think of, all right, well, why was the NFL higher on Daniels than Maye? And look, maybe it's also like some interview things, right? I mean, like, that's a big part of the process. And I'm not saying like Drake's not a good dude. I've had the opportunity to sit down and interview Drake Maye. I had a great time getting to know him and chatting with him and all that. So my experience with him was great. Anytime I've seen him on like a podcast or anything like that, or at the combine or whatever, he seemed great. But sometimes that can go into it too. Sometimes it's just a little bit of that competitive edge. Maybe the teams that interviewed Daniels maybe believe in him more, believe in that fire competitiveness, and maybe that's all the edge that you need. And then word starts getting out with the insiders and people is like, oh yeah, Jayden Daniels is the guy. He's gonna make it. He's gonna pan out amongst these other quarterbacks. So maybe that goes into it a little bit too. But in terms of overall arm talent, I lean Maye pretty easily, and that's why I ended up with him at QB2.
So the thing I wanted to ask you about, to kind of follow up, obviously I agree, like the repeatability of his drop, Jayden Daniels, I think is 100% right. Like, just the fundamentals are there. The two things that I kind of noticed or just wanted to call to your attention and get your thoughts on are his improvement over his college career, Jayden Daniels, and then also his eye discipline. His eye discipline to me just seemed to be significantly better than Drake's. And like, when I look at quarterbacks in the NFL level, at the NFL level, like, they have really good eye discipline. And it's one of the reasons that I ended up really liking JJ. I thought he did a great job of understanding what the defense was presenting and then manipulating it using his body position and his eyes. And again, like, the LSU offense was very simple. So in terms of like, what they were getting on a down and down basis, it wasn't like he was doing like brain surgery, but he was always very disciplined with his eyes. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, and if you thought that was part of like why he moved ahead of Drake in the NFL's eyes.
I do, and this is a really good point to bring up, because I think that answering those two questions are sort of one and the same. I do love Jayden Daniels' sort of path to get to this point, right? You think about him as a quarterback at Arizona State. He was basically just one read, vertical deep shot toward type of a player, or he's going to take off and run. So his time as a starter at Arizona State, he was really just winning off of being a really good athlete and having a pretty good arm. He really wasn't like taking care of the football super well, going through progressions, anything like that. He transfers over to LSU, and you can really tell. I haven't heard him say this, but this is what I think, just because of how much he dedicated himself to this. I think you can tell that he went, all right, I got out of Arizona State. I transferred to the SEC. If I don't take care of the football, I'm not going to last in this league. And if I have to transfer again, like, that might be it. Like, you can tell how much care and attention he put into becoming a better quarterback when it came to making decisions, taking care of the football in 2022. And he had one of the lowest turnover-worthy play rates in the country because of it. Now, the big-time throws were down. The average depth of target was down. He just wasn't taking as many chances. But that turnover, he did not turn the ball over in 2022. Now 2023 comes around, and you could tell he kind of says to himself, or him or his offense coordinator, his quarterback coaches, whatever. It's like, okay, you got the tendencies and the eye discipline, which you mentioned, which is a fantastic point. You've got that eye discipline down. You don't have this, over-aggressive mentality to put the ball in harm's way. But let's step it up a little bit, right? Let's push the ball down the field a little bit more. Let's get a little bit more big-time throws. Let's get the average depth of target back up. And this past year, obviously, as a Heisman Trophy winner, you saw it was the best of every single world. Now, the turnover-worthy play rate was a little bit higher, naturally, just because of how vertical the offense was. But his big-time throws through the roof compared to 2022. The average depth of target, same thing. And the turnover-worthy plays were still relatively low. Now, you talk about like the sacks taken and that kinds of stuff. He's got to get a lot better at not taking as many sacks and being able to get rid of the football a little bit better. But that's something that you can work on. But to your questions, to your point, that journey that he has had, that linear progression of getting better every single year at tangible things. Like you could point out every single step of where he got better. And it was just they say that like progress isn't always linear. And they say that for people, like kind of going through adversity and, saying like, oh, like you get up when you get knocked down. Daniels' college career is pretty much a linear progression, just going up until we saw him this past year win a Heisman Trophy. So I think it's also very easy for NFL evaluators to just see him get better every single year. And I have said this before, and I do believe this. If you flip-flop Drake's 2022 and 2023 season, I think he's QB2. I think he goes second off the board because his 2022 season was better in the eyes of evaluators than 2023 was. And it was just the fact that it's just funny to me that we act like 2022 doesn't really exist or doesn't count just because 2023 was a little bit more recent. It's like, he still did that. Like he still did that a year before. Just the offense was a little bit different this year, and it just wasn't the same year for him and the rest of the team. So I wonder where we're at if Drake Maye's 2022 and 2023 seasons were flipped, even with the progression that Daniels had. I kind of feel as though Maye would have been QB2 at that point, which is again what makes this conversation a little bit silly to me. But that's kind of a long answer to your question of Jayden's journey and how it played into how the league saw him, because I think they absolutely loved pointing out different spots where he got better every single year.
Yeah, I think the other thing you said at the end of your first answer too is where I kind of look at this discussion, which is the mental side of it and the leadership and the interviews and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder sometimes if that's smart or if that's too much of like football guys being football guys, where like the data is cold. Right. And the data just says like, this is what happened. And you have to be able to put that data in context. Everyone's got the same numbers. How your ability to interpret them is what makes you good at using the analytics, the numbers, whatever you want to call them, or not. But I do think it's interesting that we talk about so much of the intangibles, the leadership, and I look at a guy like Adam Peters who values that stuff. And I look at him drafting based off the leadership, and a guy like Mike Sanders still, it's like, yeah, he's a little undersized. Yeah, this, but like that dude's the best leader in the draft. That's who we want a Washington Commander to be. And I tend to lean towards like, maybe actually that's the correct way to look at it. That there is something about a projection that you have to understand the person and where they're going. The fact that as Adam said about Jayden and you just talked about, like, it was hard for him. He had to work for it. I do think that stuff matters. And to me, I know, look, moving forward, like I'm going to be trying to look into guys' stories more and kind of understand where they came from as much as, maybe not as much as, but certainly in conjunction with the tape. That to me is like my big takeaway from this process. I'm watching Peters go through this for the first time as an analyst up close. But I'm just curious, Trevor, to kind of double click on that part of it with you, if someone who, obviously with the amount of data you guys have at PFF, that's where you're going to start. You have great access to the tape, and that's kind of where you have made your living doing this, as someone who's really good at looking at the tape and deciphering what's there. But how much has that infiltrated your process the longer that you've done this, of kind of the human element, if you will?
Yeah, it's the ultimate cop-out for me as a draft analyst, and why I can survive for many years after this is, I can look at the tape of a guy and say like, oh, I like him. And if he doesn't work out, be like, there's something I just, I didn't
how
get to
was I
interview
supposed
him,
to know that?
I didn't know him. So no, but in all seriousness, like it's a massive piece of the pie. I've said this for years. You draft people as much as you do players, right? I mean, like that, you can evaluate all the tape that you want. You can envision them in certain parts of your scheme. But at the end of the day, a player's toughness, competitiveness, work ethic, leadership, like those are genuinely all things that hold the key. Like and when you talk about like, oh, coaches are putting them in a good situation or these kinds of things, it is simply to make these human beings more confident or believe in themselves, to maximize whatever talent that they have. That is the ultimate wild card of every single, puzzle that you put together when it comes to the picture that you are building of a prospect and how they're going to fit, and the scouting report that you have is the player aspect of it. And it's massive. And it's why teams spend so much time at the Shrine Bowl or the Senior Bowl or the Combine or those individual, not for the Commanders individual, more of a group thing when it comes to those interviews and visits that you have trying to get to know these guys and what makes them tick. I mean, you hear stories in the past of like, oh, this guy was going to draft this player number 1 overall. Like I don't know. I don't know if this actually happened or if it was just kind of like urban legend at this point. But like when the Bucs, I remember, had the first overall pick in 2015 and it was Jameis Winston or Marcus Mariota. Like I heard people say, oh, the Bucs staff like went to the janitor of Jameis Winston's high school and asked like, okay, like who was he? Who was he when he wasn't this big star and ESPN wasn't watching and all this kinds of stuff. And it's like, those are the things where you go to these great lengths simply to see who people are. And it's because you want to see what their confidence level is like within themselves, whether they believe in themselves, that competitiveness, that toughness. I mean, those are words that you just continue to hear every single time that you ask a coach. I cannot tell you how many times this has happened at the Combine. You get up there and an offensive coordinator, a head coach, or whoever it is, and you go, what are some qualities that you look for in a defensive lineman, knowing that, okay, they're probably going to draft a defensive lineman at some point in the draft. A lot of them, before they even get into any skill set, will say something like, well, qualities that you look for in an NFL player that we want on our team are, you want him to be a fierce competitor. You want him to be tough. You want him to be somebody with a good work ethic that can push themselves. And at the end of the day, like that's what matters most. We can sit here and we can talk about bend and explosiveness and arm length and all that kinds of stuff. But if you don't have the drive to be the best that you can be, then sometimes players with less talent actually end up performing better. And I think that's just that's a case of sports in general, and why the people part of scouting these guys is so important.
No doubt. And if people want more insight into the depths that teams go to find out stuff, like your high school janitor story, our friend Jordan Rodrigue, who writes for The Athletic, did this series where she was basically embedded with some of the Rams scouting department for 10 months. It's called Finding Rams. It's on The Athletic. It is incredible reporting, and some of the stuff that the Rams do throughout their process is pretty fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of other teams do similar stuff. So I would say if your interest is piqued on the janitor story, go check out Jordan's work. Of course, a former guest on the show as well in The Athletic. Trevor, this was great, dude. Always appreciate you. Thanks so much for the time. And if you have any wacky football bits that you want to do over the summer, just let us know, because we got nothing but time between now and training camp.
That sounds good. That's basically what we do on my podcast as well. So might need a little bit of a crossover, a bleed over, something like that, just so we can survive until August.
Done. That's half the work for twice the shows. I sign us up. Trevor Sikkema, everybody, Pro Football Focus. We'll see you next week on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.